مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. بفوزه في 2016 لم يسبق دونالد ترامب رئيسا للولايات المتحدة وحسب، وإنما سيطرة محكمة على الحزب الجمهوري، ومنذ ذلك الحين قويت قبضته على الحزب. وحتى الآن ربما يكون هناك 20 ديمقراطيا مرشحا للرئاسة في 2020، ولكن برغم تدني معدلات تأييد الرئيس في استعداد الرأي لم يقرر أي جمهوري بارز تحدي ترامب لنيل الترشيح. لمناقشة مستقبل الحزب الجمهوري تحت قيادة الرئيس ترامب، يسرني أن أرحب بالمحللة السياسية والرئيسة تحرير إحدى المجلات المحافظة كيلي جين تورنس. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. It's called the Grand Old Party, even if it is the younger of our two political parties. It's the party of Lincoln, the party of Reagan, and today it's the party of Donald Trump. We're going to talk today about the current and future status of the Republican Party with Kelly Jane Torrance. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kelly.
Thanks for having me.
So, Kelly, 2 years in to the Trump administration, what's the status, the big picture for the Republican Party? Is it a party that is stronger and growing, or a party that is weaker and shrinking?
That's a great question, Rob, and I think we've actually seen some big changes even in just the last few months. You mentioned 2 years into the Trump administration. I think about the midterms where a lot of the biggest critics of Donald Trump in the Republican Party actually left. They decided not to run for re-election, and I'm thinking of Bob Corker, I'm thinking of Jeff Flake. Those were two of the biggest critics of Donald Trump.
Two senators.
Exactly. And they decided not to run for re-election. And so the makeup starting in January, just a few months ago, it sort of changed, I think, in Congress. You had fewer really strong Trump critics. And in that way, the party seems a bit more unified, at least here in Washington. The biggest Trump critics are gone. Everybody else seems to be falling in line on the whole. You do hear some criticisms now and then, but it seems more unified. And if you look at Trump's approval rating in the Republican Party, it's at about 90%. Also very high. But you bring up a very good point. Is it growing or is it shrinking? And I would argue that Donald Trump really has to worry that he is actually shrinking the people who are willing to vote for the Republican Party. You'll notice, in the last few months, Donald Trump has almost shifted to a bit of a campaign mode. And the things he's saying, I think, really appeal to what, of course, we always call the base, the people who really are going to vote Republican no matter what, although the problem, of course, is getting them to the polls on Election Day. And his statements have all been geared towards those people. He hasn't really tried to reach out across the aisle to Democrats or to independents or swing voters, who are the people that often decide a presidential race.
So there have always been at least two sides to Donald Trump, the practical, realistic, let's cut a deal, transactional side, and the more extreme, let's rip it up, let's pull out, let's shut down the government side. Which side, in your view, today appeals to GOP, to Republican voters?
That's an interesting question, because I think Donald Trump really got a lot of support in 2016 when he ran for president on the sort of rip it up side that you mentioned. And I talked to a lot of people actually who said they voted for him because they said he's going to come into Washington and shake things up. I'm tired of the way things have been done. These are people who were disillusioned with both Republican and Democratic politicians. They saw Trump as someone who was going to come and shake things up. Now, that's one of the things I think the Republican establishment was a little worried about during the primaries and even after he won the nomination. And we've seen a mix since then. And even, just in the last few months, he can go back and forth on these things. He threatened to shut the border with Mexico, and he spoke for almost a week talking about, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this 100%. And then at the last minute, sort of pulled back. And it seemed, from what I could tell, that it was really establishment Republicans going to Donald Trump and saying, listen, you may want to, do something drastic. You think there's an emergency at the border, you want to do something totally different. in an attempt to solve that problem. But we've got other things to worry about. We've got the economy. If you close down the border with the third largest trading partner of the United States, this is going to be a problem for Americans. So, I think Donald Trump does have those tear him down instincts. But he's, sometimes actually willing to listen to arguments. And, the joke, I think, is that Donald Trump often does whatever he's heard from the last person who spoke to him right before he makes a decision. And some people thought that after he'd been in power for a little while, he might settle down. And I think recent events have shown that's really not the case.
And when you want to look at it from the view of the GOP constituency, not from the White House view, but from the voters' view, do you sense the same fervor for dramatic change that brought him to the White House in 2016? Is that still as animating of GOP Republican voters today as it was 2 years ago?
Yeah, no, that's another thing that I think, we've got to remember, that some of the people that voted for Donald Trump really wanted him to shake things up, and those were not people who were really that political before. They may not even have identified with the Republican Party, but there were also a lot of Republicans that wanted something different. People talk about the Republican Party being, a little bit, arguing amongst itself on some issues, as if that hasn't happened before. And of course it has, as you well know. During the George W. Bush years, for example, there was a certain segment of the Republican Party, voters and some of the people in Congress, who were not happy with the war in Iraq, for example, and those people remain. And so, for example, when Donald Trump has been criticizes John McCain, as he often does, I actually see on social media, Republicans actually in support of him for that, because they see John McCain as somebody who was someone that they would say was a supporter of endless wars, as to use a phrase that Donald Trump likes to use. And they see John McCain as a bit of a wimp. They were upset, like Donald Trump is, that he didn't help repeal Obamacare. And they actually, for many years, saw him as someone who was very friendly with Democrats, willing to work with Democrats. And so some of these debates have actually been going on for a long time in the Republican Party. Donald Trump has just brought them to the public a little bit more. We're seeing them in the open rather than just hidden beneath the surface.
So you just mentioned Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. I want to ask you about this. So there's a couple of items that seem to be high on the president's political agenda, that he's put very high in recent days. One, you said earlier, was closing the border with Mexico. Will he, won't he, within the context of the larger immigration debate? And then second is finally fully completing the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. Are these issues that resonate within the broader Republican base as much today as 2 years ago? Are they winning political issues in your view?
I think immigration can be. This is something, again, there's been a split in the Republican Party for many years. George W. Bush wanted to have comprehensive immigration reform, as they often talk about a big bill that would address many different aspects of immigration. He couldn't get that. So this is something that's divided Republicans a bit for a while. I think the base tends to be more supportive of Donald Trump's harsher stance on immigration and more restrictive stance on immigration. But you have some people in the Republican Party, and the donors especially, who are not in favor of that. Businesses like to have cheaper labor coming in from other countries. They like to have a bigger labor pool from which to choose, and that's something that means a less restrictive immigration policy. So I think it is something a little divisive, but on the whole, I think the Republican base is in support of Donald Trump's vision on this. And the Democrats, I don't think, are helping themselves by saying that some of them say a border is immoral. I think a lot of them, not even just Republicans, a lot of Americans have trouble understanding how a country's borders themselves are immoral. So I think that is something that could help them. Healthcare, I think a lot of us were surprised when Robert Mueller's report on Russian influence in the 2016 election and whether Trump campaign officials colluded. When we heard that report had been completed and apparently found that there was no collusion, a lot of us were surprised that President Donald Trump then immediately started talking about health care. It seemed almost as if he didn't have an idea beforehand. He didn't realize this report was going to come out and at least partly exonerate him, and he didn't seem to have a plan for what he was going to shift to talking about afterwards. And he seemed to have just started talking about health care out of the blue. I think health care has been a bad issue for Republicans. They campaigned for 8 years on repealing Obamacare and then couldn't do it. And I think that is one of the big issues that hurt them in the 2018 midterms. So I do not see health care as a winning issue for Republicans. And you have Donald Trump talking about making Republicans the party of health care before there's even a plan. They had 8 years to come up with an alternative to Obamacare. They never did, and they still don't have one. So I find that shift a little puzzling.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about lessons learned from the November House loss for Republicans and look at already early Republican plans for 2020 in just a moment. Our guest today again is Kelly Jane Torrance. Kelly is a senior editor with the Washington Examiner and a regular commentator on Fox News. Formerly the deputy managing editor at the Weekly Standard, a major thought magazine of the conservative movement, her work has been published in newspapers around America, including the Los Angeles Times, the San Diego Union Tribune, and the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. So, Kelly, first just a foreign policy question before we move back to politics. America First, it was the slogan from Inauguration Day, and it has animated the president's approach to the world ever since. Now that we've seen this 2+ years in practice, how have Republican voters warmed to the idea? Is this something that they appreciate?
I think in some ways they do, Rob. Again, some Republicans were a little unhappy with what Donald Trump calls endless wars in the Middle East, and they were very happy to see, for example, Donald Trump announcing he was going to bring home all the troops from Syria and is looking to do the same thing in Afghanistan. But I think a lot of people also understand that these issues are a little more complicated. When you say America First, it's not quite a thought-out doctrine, and I think Donald Trump himself has recognized that. For example, when Bashar Assad used chemical weapons once again on his own citizens in Syria, Donald Trump actually saw images of women and children just in awful, awful pain, and he actually decided to take action, and he did some very limited airstrikes in Syria. Some of his supporters were a little upset about that. They felt that he had kind of gone back on his word not to stay involved in the Middle East so much. But I think a lot of his voters said there's nothing wrong with that. These are very limited movements. And, one of the problems, I think, is that Donald Trump needs to figure out how America First can also mean America being a leader in terms of human rights, in terms of showing the world, being a beacon of freedom, as Ronald Reagan might have said. And I think we've seen some mixed things on that. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how the situation in Venezuela, for example, plays out. Some people are surprised that Donald Trump is talking so much about that and getting involved again. This is a place where he is getting involved. So I think he himself still talks about America First, but we've seen some shifts on that. And so far, I don't think American voters are too upset about the things he does. He certainly hasn't started a new war, and the things he is doing, it's targeted, it's specific. When we're talking about Syria, Venezuela, it's very specific. So I think voters are fine with that.
All right, let's turn to Republican Party politics. Lessons of the loss of the House of Representatives in November 2016, and what can you already see, reading the tea leaves, what can you already see in terms of how the Republicans approach 2020, at least in the congressional elections, a little bit differently than they did last time?
Yeah, as I said, I really do think healthcare was one of the issues that hit Republicans badly in the midterms, and that's why I'm a little surprised to see Donald Trump talking about it right now. And you don't really see a lot of people in Congress talking about healthcare. I think they're a little nervous about that. They recognize that there's not any sort of win that Congress can bring to America to show them in 2020. I mean, one of the things they tried to do right before the midterms was they needed a legislative win. They thought Obamacare repeal was going to be that win. It didn't happen. So then they shifted to tax reform. And that was something that they actually did get done. And they actually, a lot of people supported that, and not just businesses, middle class. But the Democrats did a very good job of trying to say it was just the rich who were winning out on that. Republicans did not do a very good job of selling how many people in the middle class were going to win on that. And I think people did see it in their paychecks. You thought that, people see extra money in their paycheck, it's going to help. And I think it did help them perhaps keep the Senate, but it didn't help them enough in the House. So I think what they're going to be looking at as we get closer to 2020 is some specific legislation that they can pass to take to the people. And at first it looked like maybe they were going to try something on health care. But of course, within days of Donald Trump talking about the Republicans being a party of health care, he said he's not going to have a vote on that before the election in November 2020. So right now it's difficult to see what they're going to decide on as something that they can bring. I mean, people like to see something specific. This idea that, hey, the economy's great, we're doing well. I think that's not enough, at least at the congressional level. People want to go to their district saying, hey, look, this is what I did back in Washington. And they can't just say, well, the economy's doing great, I'm taking credit for that. They need something specific, so I think they really need to find something. And they've got a little time to do it, but not a lot.
And for that group of competitive races in the House and the Senate, not everyone is competitive, but for the competitive races, do you expect Republican candidates, to be joined at the hip to the president, or are they going to seek a little distance from the president?
Yeah, that's a good question, Rob. And it really, of course, depends on the district. You saw during the midterms that there were some candidates who were often talking about their relationship with Donald Trump, and others who never mentioned the president. And I think, you're really going to probably wait to see what Donald Trump's approval ratings are closer to 2020. It's kind of, I feel like in Washington right now, people are it's almost like a reset. After it came out that Robert Mueller had completed his report and found no collusion, a lot of people in Washington had been waiting for that. And a lot of people thought there might be something really bad in that could really damage the president. And I think that's why we saw some people talking about making a primary challenge to Donald Trump, for example. And we've heard a little less about that since news of the report has come out. So, people were kind of waiting for that report to see how is the president going to do. He seems to have weathered that storm so far. What's next? The Democrats obviously are trying to do further investigations in the House and the Senate, but if they don't amount to anything, Donald Trump could actually surprisingly be looking better in 2020 than even in 2016, which was such a close race.
Right. So I wanted to ask you just about this. Does the exhale after the Mueller report, does that ease Republican fears that, if Mueller couldn't find anything, we're not really so worried about these Democratic investigations? Or is there something out there that Republicans are fearing that maybe Democrats are actually onto something?
It's possible. I mean, the Trump tax return fight is one thing. Donald Trump is really the first president in the modern era not to release his tax returns. It's not legally required, but by tradition, people running for president have done it. He has not, and people, of course, want to know why not. Is there something in there? Some Democrats even wonder, will it show that he's got business with the Russians? I think, maybe some people are just worried it's going to show this is a very rich man who doesn't pay very many taxes. So that is something.
Or he's not as rich as he thinks.
Exactly. I mean, he does talk about how much of a billionaire he is, and there's questions on whether he has padded his resume a little bit, so to speak. So yeah, there's still some things out there. But I do think that there is a huge sigh of relief. And, you saw that with the swagger that Donald Trump had in his very first sort of campaign-style rally he held after it first was reported that the Mueller report was completed. He had a lot of swagger. Since then, he's toned it down a little bit. But yeah, I think Republicans are breathing a huge sigh of relief. And that's why I'm a little surprised they didn't seem to have a plan B in a way. Hey, if this report comes out, nothing bad is in it, what should we pivot to? What should we talk about next to the American people? And strangely enough, I don't think they really were prepared for that.
Big picture question. Donald Trump, 2016, quite brilliantly figured out how to win by energizing what most observers look at as an older, whiter base than one would think would lead a candidate to victory. When you look at the last couple of years, do you see any effort to broaden the base? Latinos, blacks, younger people, others? or is it still energize that group as much as possible?
I think the president's strategy has been to energize that group as much as possible. And that's why you see him hammering home the same issues nearly every day on Twitter. Often it seems rarely a day goes by on Twitter when he doesn't mention immigration and the wall. He talks about issues he thinks are going to do well with the base, making fun of Democrats on certain things. He doesn't seem to be reaching out much, but behind the scenes there is more outreach. I think Republicans do recognize, they should. I mean, again, this was a close race in 2016. Not everybody who supported President Trump in 2016 still supports him now. It makes sense to reach out for more.
Kelly, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Washington.
Great discussion.
Excellent. Looked through the lens of today's politics, it is easy to understand why the Republican Party has the reputation of being the establishment party, the party of the status quo, the party of big business, large corporations, mainstream religious institutions. Of course, this wasn't always the case. In American history, the Republicans are the new kid on the block. The Democrats have been around about 50 years longer. In fact, the Democratic Party has the longest continuous existence of any political party in the world. By contrast, the Republican Party was only born in 1854 as a party of change, the fight against slavery, and it had quick and stunning success. Within just 6 years, it got one of its own elected president, Abraham Lincoln. And over the next century, Republicans were often the party of maverick change, led by such people as Theodore Roosevelt, the greatest environmentalist of his age. Teddy's cousin, Franklin, changed all that. He made the Democratic Party the party of change, and the Republicans were content to veer right, becoming the party of tradition and conservatism. There were always different strains and currents within the party: religious and social conservatism, fiscal conservatism, defense and national security conservatism, and they fought for primacy within the party's big tent. But from Ronald Reagan to George W. Bush, the party found a way to accommodate all these faces of conservatism. Under President Trump, the glue that kept the party together has frayed. For large segments of the party, the idea of America first, manifested in policies on immigration, trade, reaction to global disasters, and even climate change, seemed to turn its back on America's leadership role in the world. Here, too, the unique personality of the president played a role. Some who spent their entire adult lives as Republicans became never-Trumpers. Others swallowed hard and followed the president's lead. The party is now clearly the president's, and the Democrats are just as clearly the party that is defined by its antipathy to him. But is that enough for either party to animate the American people, providing them with ideas and values, powerful organizing tools to serve as the organizing vehicle for our politics? As much as anything else, our 2020 election is about that question. In that sense, the election is not just about our choice of leaders. It is also about the very political system in which we choose our leaders. This is a very big deal. This will be a very big election. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول الحزب الجمهوري بعد عهد إدارة ترامب، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.